Hello everyone, and thanks for tuning in to get your weekly doses of depressing topics from me. Today I want to talk about the bombing of Dresden. Not so much about the bombing itself, but more about the discourse surrounding it and why it's so toxic. There's a lot of misinformation surrounding it, especially online, and the way the extreme right and the extreme left deal with this controversial topic is really off-putting to me. Let's tackle the misinformation first. And who would be better to demonstrate what I'm talking about than one of the most popular YouTubers on this website? Here's Ethan explaining the bombing of Dresden, and I will explain later why this is so important.
So after World War II ended, like 2 days after the Nazis surrendered officially, the Allies went and bombed. Dresden was like a historic city in Germany, said to be one of the most beautiful cities to ever exist. And it was untouched by the war because it was just a civilian city. There was no military there. Right. 2 days after the war ended, the Allies, England specifically, and I think America, they firebombed the whole fucking city just out of straight revenge. And they killed 300,000 civilians. Something like that.
Are you sure it's not 500,000, Ethan? To put these numbers into perspective, 300,000 people dead would be a higher death toll than the one caused by the 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japan put together and then doubled. But let's allow him to finish.
And they burned the whole city to the ground.
That's a true story.
It's a true story. It happened.
And
Look
he
it up.
lived
The
through
bombing
that,
of Dresden.
And his story is so crazy because they were all hiding
in a meat factory.
That's why it's called Slaughterhouse.
That was
right?
the name. So
So you tell it.
So the bombs were dropping. He was a prisoner of war with the Germans, and they went underground to a meat factory called Slaughterhouse 5. And underneath, they heard all the bombs dropping and shit. They were under there for days. And when they came out, the whole city was leveled, tons of dead civilians, and he was ordered by the Germans that he had to clean up everything. He had to get all the bodies out, all the charred corpses of women and children and civilians.
Now at this point I was really hoping for someone in the room to say something like, wait, he was ordered by the Germans to clean up the bodies 2 days after Germany surrendered to the Allies? That sounds kinda odd, Ethan.
But the bombing of Dresden is really fascinating. You should check that out. Because you think about the Allies, you know, history is written by the victors. And you think about the Allies as like, we rode in on our fucking horses and saved the day from the Nazis. But that shit was just pure villainy.
It hurts. It actually hurts listening to this. Now to ease off Ethan a bit, this isn't purely his fault, because the book that he is talking about also got it wrong. Although it didn't get it quite as wrong as he does. My copy of the book puts the death toll at about 135,000, which is still wrong, but, you know, it's closer to the real number. Now let's take this point by point. When did the bombing occur? The bombing that Ethan and the book talk about did of course not happen after the war, but several months before the official surrender of Nazi Germany. Specifically 13th to 15th February 1945. The official end of World War II was in early May 1945. Was Dresden untouched by the war before the bombing in question? No, the Allies started dropping bombs on the greater Dresden area from 1944 onwards, although not nearly in the scale as in mid-February. Was Dresden a purely civilian city? Well, that's also no. Dresden was a major railway hub for the Germans to transport war material to the Eastern Front, as well as to transport the victims of the Nazi regime to the death camps further to the east. Dresden also had a bunch of war-related industry, and at least 50,000 people who lived in Dresden worked in the arms industry, as well as several forced workers from the concentration camps surrounding the city. Now let's look at the military. In February 1945, Dresden was the last major garrison town supporting the Eastern Front and had about 20,000 troops stationed in the area at that time. Mostly draftees from the Volkssturm, the Hitler Youth, but also troops belonging to the Waffen-SS, equipped with roughly 250 anti-aircraft guns to protect some of Dresden's factories. In January 1945, the troops and forced workers started turning Dresden into a stronghold to face the advancing Red Army, on orders of Colonel General Heinz Guderian. I would like to make a cut here, because talking about the death toll will take a bit longer, but up to this point everything Ethan said was incorrect. But when we get to the death tolls, he really knocks it out of the park. How many people died in the bombing in mid-February? This has been the cause for a lot of controversy since the bombing, until the city of Dresden got fed up with it in 2004 and set up a commission of historians, which was made up of 15 people to settle the question of the death toll. This commission worked for 5 years, and in November 2009 they released their nearly 100-page report on the topic. They came to the following conclusion. I'm paraphrasing here, by the way. The Commission comes to the conclusion that the German death toll for the air raids on Dresden from the 13th February to the 15th February 1945 does not exceed 25,000 people killed. 25,000. And they even specifically debunked the claim that 300,000 people died in the raids, which was propagated by famous Holocaust denier David Irving in his book The Destruction of Dresden, back when he still had some credibility. Maybe that's where so many people get the wrong numbers from. Anyway, if there were really 300,000 people killed, the missing death certificates for the alleged victims would be higher than 3/4 of all civilian death certificates issued during the entire war by Germany, which is, to quote the report, impossible when looking at the greater historical context. They also debunked a couple of other claims, like that the airplanes flew extra low and shot at the people fleeing from the city and that sort of stuff. Now you might be wondering why this is worth a video. A big YouTuber got a random historical event wrong, so what? No need to be such a smartass about it. And here's where we get into the discourse surrounding the Dresden bombings. The claims made by Ethan and the death toll stated by Kurt Vonnegut are, well, there's no easy way to say this, Nazi propaganda. No, I'm sure Ethan didn't do this intentionally, but he did it nonetheless. One day after the bombing, the propaganda ministry under Joseph Goebbels issued a press release that stated that Dresden had no war industries and was a city of culture. They framed the bombing as a long-planned extermination of the German people and framed it as a genocide to shift the blame of the war to the Allies and to portray Germany as the victim of, quote, barbarians. And neo-Nazis repeat the allegation of genocide to this day, but I'll talk about that later. Shortly after the first publication, they published a leaflet claiming about 200,000 people had died and called it a massacre of refugees, meaning the Allied bombs mostly killed refugees who fled the advancing Red Army, which is proven wrong by the fact that it was prohibited for refugees to settle in the greater Dresden area. The foreign press picked it up, and that's how it entered the public discourse, Kurt Vonnegut's book Slaughterhouse-5, and eventually Ethan's podcast. And here's where we get to the real problem, how the bombing is used today. For the most part, neo-Nazis used Dresden, as described by Ethan, not how it actually happened, to draw equivalences between the Allies and Nazi Germany. You know, violence on both sides and that sort of stuff. This happens in Germany every year, but also on the internet. Some people go as far to call it the bombing Holocaust, as you can see in this picture. But usually it's used as a history is written by the victors sort of thing. And now and then someone mentions it in an odd way, which shows the lasting impact of the propaganda, like Lauren Southern, for instance, in her video Say Goodbye to History.
In acts of war, many innocents were killed by the victors that we celebrate today. Look at Winston Churchill. I was happy to get a picture with his statue in London, but let's say people demand it be taken down one day due to the Dresden bombings.
Now, while Lauren would rank the bombing of Dresden as a justification to take down Churchill's statue over something like the Bengal famine is anyone's guess, but I can only assume that in her mind it's similar to what Ethan described, which wouldn't surprise me since she believes a lot of dumb shit. To get to the heart of the issue, every year, on the anniversary of the bombing, neo-Nazis attempt to march through Dresden, and every year there are people blocking them from doing so, which I'm thankful for. I don't want these guys to appropriate the victims of the bombing for their agenda. On the other hand, are banners celebrating the bombing really necessary? I dislike this kind of stuff because it's possible to object to neo-Nazis without celebrating an event which is, in my mind at least, morally ambiguous. This kind of protest is more likely to push the average population away from you. And I get that they are just doing this to take the piss out of neo-Nazis and to combat the victim myth propagated by the extreme right, but just think about how this looks for a minute. Now I should note that the people holding up signs like this are the absolute fringe minority. Most of the people who show up to disrupt these Nazi marches are ordinary people, just wanting to keep neo-Nazis from marching through their city, and I think that's really great of them. Nonetheless, these signs do show up every year. The bombing of Dresden was justified, but to pretend that it was something great and to praise the man who conducted it almost fanatically really leaves a bad taste in my mouth. Although the lines between civilian and soldier get blurry in a total war, there were still children, you know? And even during the war, the way the air raids were being conducted was heavily criticized in Britain. Some politicians were worried that the targeting of civilians to break the enemy's morale would poison any relationship with Nazi-free Germany, and the controversy about the air raids continues to this day, especially about Arthur Harris, who some of his aircrews called Butcher Harris because he was so ready to sacrifice their lives. The unveiling of his statue was met with a variety of protests from Germans and British people. You know, it's possible to discuss these things without falling into the extremes of opinions. But let's not forget that the Allies were fighting a genocidal regime which would have never stopped in its brutal quest for power. And to quote a German military official, the most humane war is a quick one. As you see, it's not as clear-cut as both sides make it out to be sometimes, and it's possible to acknowledge that the bombing of Dresden was necessary while still seeing it as a tragedy. Now, I will not get into if the bombing of Dresden was actually a war crime in the legal sense of the term, that deserves a video on its own, but because I know that there are a lot of people on YouTube who think something like the bombing of Dresden should never be accepted, even when fighting an enemy like Nazi Germany, I will leave you with a quote from a survivor of the ghetto Theresienstadt that I read a couple of years ago. "We cried tears of joy as we saw the red glow in the sky. Dresden is burning. The Allies are not far away." That's it for today. Thanks for watching, everyone, as always. And if there are any topics that you would like to see covered in the future, leave a comment and please keep it civil down there. And subscribe if you enjoy this kind of content. See ya!